And there's another thing that I learned with startups, right, which is the peak of elation and the trough of despair. So the peak of elation is incredibly narrow. It lasts for literally a fleeting moment. And the troughs of despair go forever. And if you're not someone who has come from a basic background, right, of having to deal with that and built that grit, you're just going to fail.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 144 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have David Lemphers as my guest for this episode. Dave has recently moved back to Australia after spending the last 12 years in the US. He initially moved there to be an early team member as part of the Windows Azure engineering team before jumping out and launching his own startups. To date, Dave has co-founded and successfully exited 4 AI startups, including ZenDeals, which was acquired by RetailMeNot for $22 million just 2 years after launching, and his latest startup, CodePilot, which was acquired by AngelList. If that wasn't enough, Dave has also authored 3 US patents on AI and machine learning and serves as the CTO in residence at Techstars. As you can imagine, we covered a wide range of topics in this interview, including Dave's lessons from launching, growing, and successfully exiting 4 startups, how to set up and negotiate acquisition deals, what happens when an acquisition actually goes through, how to attract great talent as a startup, how to create a state of flow for your team, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with David Lemphers. Dave, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast. We were just saying that this is the very first podcast that you're doing, so very, very excited to have you on the show. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on and making this your first time.
Thank you for having me, mate.
So Dave, for those people that may not be as familiar with you, your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, so Melbourne born and bred. I went to Swinburne Uni to do my undergraduate degrees in computer science and software engineering. Went and worked in industry for a couple of years. And, my first kind of entrepreneurial experience was, I was working in my job, had an idea, wrote a paper for my boss. He didn't look at it, So one day I went into his office and I saw it under a bunch of papers and I was like, this kind of sucks. So decided to go out on my own. I was 22 and just went through this amazing experience where, it's everything you imagine like a 22-year-old running a startup would look like. I remember us taking our first revenue check and going and buying better graphics cards for our computers so we could play Counter-Strike. And so that was kind of like the strategy, going forward. But exited that business, which was an amazing experience, and then went, to work at Microsoft. Got to go move to the US and be part of the team that built Windows Azure, which was a really formative experience for me as an engineer, especially coming from Australia. And then, went and worked at PwC for a year, running their cloud computing practice in North America, which again was an incredibly formative experience. Did startup number 2 with a very dear set of friends. That was an amazing experience. Pitching at Sandal Road, raising money from Eric Schmidt, and then, getting acquired for a kind of life-changing, kind of amount of money only less than 2 years later. And so ended up in Austin, Texas, had very interesting experiences of earning out, for 2 years with an acquiring company and what it feels like to be inside that kind of organization. And then left, did another startup with my founder, Chris, and we took that through Techstars. That got acquired. I went back to Microsoft as an applied data scientist and got to work on some really interesting projects there. And then, came up with my last startup, CodePilot, while I was at Microsoft. Did that. That got acquired by AngelList in, towards the end of 2019. And then moved back to Australia and then, started working at AWS, and the startup team with yourself. And it's been like an amazing experience and an amazing ride. Excited to share it.
Absolutely. And, I don't think we're going to have any shortage of topics to talk about. I remember the first time that we spoke. I think I came over to say bye, when I was leaving the office. We ended up talking for an hour and a half later in front of Flinders Street Station. So, totally. Trying to stick to roughly an hour for this interview is going to be a struggle. Luck. But Dave, obviously, so much of your background that I want to sort of touch on. And for anyone that's kind of missed everything that you spoke about, 4 startups and 4 exits, an absolutely incredible journey that you've had to date. One thing that you sort of mentioned was the experience that you had in the US. And as part of the research for this interview, I got to speak to George, who's a close friend of yours
Yep.
from uni and also an investor in your earliest companies. One of the things that he mentioned was that you had an American accent even before you went to the US. And he was just kind of talking about how sort of, obsessed you were with sort of American culture and American sports and things like that too. How important was it for you to be in the US, working at Microsoft and having those opportunities there, but also running your startups there as well?
Oh, mate, what a great vector in, right? So you're right. I always had like an interesting accent, and I actually picked it up from my grandma, who had somewhat of a Dutch twang to her accent. So it wasn't American. It was just some of my vowels sound, with a certain American aspect to them. So growing up, I played, my parents are Sri Lankan. I played rugby as a kid. And when I got to 15, a bunch of American expats had come to Australia and decided that we're going to set up a gridiron league, American Football League. And they came to a bunch of high schools and they showed these videos like they were the NFL films. And I was like, this looks amazing. I sort of want to do this, right? So I joined the inaugural year of football, and all the coaches were American. And the first thing I realized that I really loved about that American culture is it's incredibly goal-focused and it's a meritocracy. So it didn't matter that you had kids from Box Hill High School, kids from Carey Grammar, like public schools or private schools. What all that mattered to the coaches was how did you perform and how did you execute? And I caught that bug very early. When I got into my first year of working at Mobil Oil, again, lots of Americans, lots of Texans. And they're no bullshit. They're a hardworking group. They have a very clear focus on what they need to do and they go after it. And they're also a little irreverent. So there isn't this sense of the playbook anymore, right? You just kind of go and get at it. So that conflicted with the Australian culture at that time, and there certainly wasn't an entrepreneurial feel, certainly as it feels today. And there wasn't also scale. So that was the other thing I really realized, was that hunger to do something at large scale, because when you start to approach a certain size, things change very rapidly. So when I got over to the US, the first thing that struck me was you could have whatever you wanted across the board. You just had to want it bad enough, and you had to want it more than the person next to you. And at the time, I thought that was amazing. So Microsoft's engineering culture circa 2008, quote unquote, was a shipping culture. But the internal, engineering culture left bruises. There was really no place to just, for niceties. And I think my experience playing football under American coaches really prepared me for that. And I just reveled in it. I loved it. I took on as much responsibility as I could. I stretched myself well past what I thought was possible. And in the technical realm, I was presented with problems at a size and scale that just wasn't available in Australia. And I got to not only grow myself, but observe others who are also on a similar journey. So for example, Yusuf Khalidi, who was my mentor, was one of the original inventors of Solaris. So you're sitting in meetings with people like Dave Cutler, right? And Brian Tuttle. And so, you're no longer reading about these heroes in these books, right? You're actually sitting across the meeting room table and watching how they operate. And I think I synthesized a lot, right? And I learned a lot about how they execute. And then when we did ZenDeals and we got to go and pitch at, Sand Hill Road, and we got to work with, again, like some phenomenal folks through Innovation Endeavors, I was just constantly synthesizing, right? And I think the way you synthesize is you observe and you repeat, and you try and emulate until it just becomes muscle memory. And then you start to build your own intuition about that, right? So, by the time CodePilot came, you're now practicing on your own muscle memory, right? And it's no longer observing someone else and seeing what they're doing. But I think that when I reflect on my time in the US and I reflect on why the US does so well from a startup perspective, it's because, good or bad, the scale of the economy and the number of people and the population in America just creates a situation where if you don't compete at the top level, you just drop to the bottom and you never get back up. In Australia, we can actually have a really great life and never have to do a startup, or never have to innovate, really, right? Like we can live a wonderful life and own a house and retire happy and travel around Australia, and life's really good here, right? And in America, it's not the case. So you have to innovate, you have to invent, and when you do that, you have to reach levels that aren't necessary anywhere else because you've just got that many people, that many mouths to feed. So yeah, I think if you want to go and expand your, kind of lung capacity, a place like America is an amazing place to do it. How long you can run that marathon for, that's, for me, 12 years, right? And I tapped out. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that. I remember the first time that I interviewed Rachel Newman as well. She mentioned something very similar about the difference between Australian and US culture. But she mentioned, the fact that we have a safety net should provide more of a platform for people to take risks. Like if you have such a big safety net, it should be more comfortable, but it never really quite works out that way because, as you said, that kind of comfortable middle is, it's great for society in general, but makes it a little bit difficult for people to, I guess, have that hunger to take the risk.
So the way I think about that, and again, having worked with people who are from incredible privilege, and some of the people at Microsoft who had started in the very early days, had amassed so much wealth, there was still the people who brought it every day, right? Like Dave Cutler is one of the most phenomenal, storied engineers on the planet and was the first guy at Building 109, 6 a.m. in the morning. There's his Land Rover, not parked in the garage. He parks right out front, in the open air car park. And he's the last one to leave, right? And he's, just bringing it every day and has no need to. And then you've got other folks who don't have anything and they're playing it crazy safe, right? And I think at the end of the day, whether you have a safety net or not, there's a general internal, flywheel in just people who go after kind of startups. And it's really just a tension that, can't be resolved working, at a company earning a paycheck. And I don't think if those people had safety blankets or safety nets or not, I don't think it would necessarily matter. So, so then why is it that Australia, for example, doesn't necessarily have the same kind of ecosystem as the US? I think it's because we have first generation Australians of families and parents who came here from countries that had nothing. They were dirt poor. And when they came here, they instilled very early in their children that the Australian lifestyle was go get a really good job, low risk, buy your house, pay it off, don't own the bank a cent, and then you've made it. You got out of the village, right? You did well. And the problem with that is you quell any curiosity, you quell any sense of entrepreneurship, and you ultimately quell any desire for control over your future. So that was one of the things that always struck me, right? Is you're at Microsoft, people earning really good money, and they're feeling like that's really safe, right? And going to a startup is really unsafe. But your actual control at a company earning a wage is practically zero. You have no control, right? If they turn around tomorrow and decide to fire you, you have zero control. In a startup, you have all the control. So if you decide that you're going to do well, it's because you've decided that, right? And no one can take that away from you. And you could argue that market forces and customer forces can impact you, but at the same time, you can control that as well, right? But you can't really control how your boss sees you, and you can't really control like macro, aspects of a company. So I think that's always something that struck me about, safety nets, right? Is they sometimes aren't really what you think they are. And, if you're the right kind of operator, you can actually control a lot of the variables.
It's interesting. Like I've had a lot of conversations with people in terms of, things are slowly starting to change, but still, you ask the sort of average university student what they sort of aspire to go and do afterwards is go to an investment bank, go and work at a big four sort of accounting firm. And particularly, I think you kind of mentioned the cultural element, and we've spoken about that previously in terms of like Sri Lankan and Indian sort of cultural backgrounds and expectations in terms of what does success look like and what are you supposed to do. Was that a difficult process for you? Again, jumping back 12 plus years, very, very different sort of ecosystem, very different sort of if there was an ecosystem at all back then. Yeah, what was that process like for you in deciding to kind of leave that and jump into doing startups?
So again, I think when I look back on that experience, the reason I did a startup, and we've talked about this before, right, is I tend to not run away from a boiling pot. I tend to want to go towards like a nice green grass or like a nice garden, right? So I very rarely like leave a situation because it sucks. I want to go to something that's really good. And I think what happened in the first instance was I didn't know what a startup was, right? I'd never been exposed to it other than my parents had run a bakery when I was really young. And I saw that even though it was hard slog, they had so much control, and that control gave them so much satisfaction. And I remember that, right? I remember how meaningful that meant. And so, I'm working, in industry, and I'm frustrated that there's a clear opportunity to go and invent and build something, but I'm not allowed to do it. But I'm not allowed to do it just because someone says so. And that just felt like kind of weird, right? And at the same time, right, I'm 22. My overall cost of living is super low, and I can shrink it even lower, right? So at the time I was living in a tiny little flat in Paran. I think I was paying like 80 to 90 bucks a week. It was nothing, right? And I thought to myself, if I spend the next year scratching this itch, it'll be really meaningful for me. But I didn't know what a startup was, right? So all I did was I quit my job, right? I got into my house and I just started hacking on this product. And I then was like, I guess I need to like sell this and earn a living, right? So I everything was just very kind of like haphazard, right? So I reached out to an old friend, and then they connected me with someone, and then I got in front of Asa Abloy, Lockwood, the ops manager, and showed him my product. He was like, I think that's great. We'll take it. And then I was like, okay. And then he was like, who else are your customers? And I was like, I don't really have a pipeline. And he's like, well, let me introduce you to some other people. And so because I never had a formal knowledge of what it was, I had to like uncover each part of the map in a really inefficient way. And it was really hard because there wasn't, first of all, even if there was venture capital, I wouldn't have known about it. So I thought you just bootstrap, right? Like that's what my mom and dad with the bakery, right? So I was like, hand to mouth, right? We'd sell a thing, we'd bring it in, we'd do some development, and at the time as well, Australia really suffered from this. Like if you didn't know, it was who you know, right? So I never went to a fancy private school, and I'd get into these sales situations where someone's like, oh, actually we've gone with this other mob because I actually know, what's his name's dad. And, we went to school together at Melbourne Boys School or whatever it was. And so I very quickly started to realize like, okay, there's a club, right? And, I'm not part of it. And again, I think that meritocracy kept coming up over and over again, right? And it wasn't, again, until I got to the US that I realized this is a place where, if you sharpen your skills and are focused on execution, you will succeed. And it was just contrasting, right? It was such a contrast to being in Australia.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I had very similar reasons for getting into startups as well. Like I think what you kind of mentioned about control, but also not feeling limited by someone, where it was up to someone else to decide whether I would move up or get promoted or all of those sort of things. I wanted to have control over, as you mentioned, if I work hard, then I can achieve an outcome. And if I don't, then it's on me. But at least the control is mine and the decision is mine around those sort of things is also really fascinating that we kind of share that. But one thing that you mentioned previously in terms of your experience in the US, and as you mentioned, a lot of these people that you would kind of see or hear, but then finally being able to sit across the table from them. Obviously, given everything that happened with COVID last year, we're sort of moving more to a remote world. Everyone is talking about remote work in general. Do you still think that moving to the US or moving to the Valley in particular still is as important for founders, or has that same kind of appeal that it had for you back then?
So I think about this in kind of two different ways, right? And very much from a systems thinking perspective. So the fact that we work remotely is great when you just need to orchestrate discrete tasks. So if you and I need to get on a meeting and we don't need to meet, right? So I think there were elements of press the flesh, thinking, which was a waste, right? Like I need to fly down to San Jose and meet this customer just so they see that I'm a human being, right? And do some pre-sales kind of stuff. That can just go away. It's a waste of time. What you can't get through a Zoom call is all of the micro experiences that happen day to day, right? You could potentially close a deal with someone if you've built a relationship with them. You don't need to go to that meeting with, Rando X just for the sake of it. But what you will absolutely miss is the overall feel of what it's like to be in a crucible. And I think to me, it's not even like go to the US, because I was in Austin for 6 years, and I can tell you right now, the Austin startup scene is nothing close to like Seattle's scene, which is nothing close to San Francisco's. So having had experience both in San Francisco and Seattle, again, there's a vibe, there's a palpable feeling of things going on. So when, for example, you can't dial in to the local user group, right, in Seattle, right, in downtown, you can't dial into that. And then once the conference is finished or once the presentation is finished, bump into someone who's just finished their PhD at UW in distributed systems and have them share with you that they've got some great idea and you go, oh, wow, that's game changing. Hey, man, can I hack with you this weekend? You can't do those things, right, in a fully remote culture. So when you hear these stories of people like Slack, for example, go like, oh, we're just fully distributed, that's fine, right? But what they're distributing is the pure workload. And what they're reducing is the stuff that didn't need to happen in the old days, right? But what you will absolutely miss is the overall environment, you know, and that kind of feeling and energy that happens in these pockets where, and then the difference is when you're there, opportunities come up, right? In a way that they just can't happen, you know, outside of that environment. And you also start to become that person, right? Because, you know, like the only way, you know, to experience the jungle is to go into the jungle, right? Like no one can tell you what it feels like on your skin. No one can tell you what it sounds like, you know, in kind of the ambient environment. Like you have to actually go in there and just sit there for a while. So yeah, if you're a founder and you're wanting the same experience that's available in the US, you're going to have to just get on a plane and go there. And you're going to have to stay there for a considerable amount of time so that all of those elements imbue themselves into you. You can't, unfortunately, get it from a distance, right? Like anything in life, you know, you're not going to pick up that formative knowledge from afar, right? You're just going to have to go right into the epicenter.
Yeah, like that was actually going to be my next question in terms of, you mentioned that like the scene in Austin is obviously very different. Just really curious in terms of how you thought about when you were running your own startups there, or what your cadence was like, you know, were you sort of regularly sort of traveling to San Francisco, or what did that sort of process look like for you? And I guess for founders that are in Australia that, you know, have travel restrictions in place, do you have any suggestions on how they can sort of overcome that and still have that kind of pockets of energy, or still try and imbue themselves with those qualities?
So I think, let me go backwards from that, right? So I think right now there's travel restrictions. You can't go over to the US. But there's a lot of people here who've been there and know what it looks like, right? So I love that term when you like hear like these military movies, right? And they're like, yeah, I was in the shit, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like they've got the 1,000-yard stare, right? Like, because he's been in the shit, right? And it's like, so how do you get in the shit if you can't get in the shit, right? Well, first of all, you go connect with the people who have. And you try and distill what it was that created that environment. Because as I'll always say, it's very rarely the bits and the bytes, right? Like it's almost always human. And then what you do is you try and recreate it here, because that's the opportunity that's being missed, right? Is the opportunity that's being missed is Australians are going, oh crap, I can't get on a plane and go to San Francisco. So I'm just going to do what's always been done in Australia, right? And no one's taking this opportunity to go, we may never get a chance to go over there, right? At least in the short term. So how do you create your New York hip hop scene? You create your local hip hop scene influenced and informed by that, right? But you have to be very committed to a long-term vision to do that. And I think that's my biggest complaint around the innovation programs in Australia is they don't actually have a goal of building a 25, 30-year culture that, again, wasn't a plan back in the HPs, the Microsofts back in the day. They just started the way they started. But as you've seen with like the PayPal mafia and stuff like that, they've plowed that money back in because they want a long range ecosystem. And I think, again, no one has stepped up in the Australian government, for example, or even the people who've made money in startups. And they've not gone, I'm going to invest in a 25-year vision of what this looks like. That's going to look very similar in outputs to the US, but doesn't have to look like the US. It can just look like an Aussie version. So that's the first thing. I think if you're coveting the US experience, recognize that you can absolutely build your own one here, but it'll be a culture development experience, not a technical development experience. That's the first thing. So let's say that's gone, right? And now you can travel again. You know, do you decide to go to the US or not? It really just comes down to what's the experience you want, right? Like the US is the US because, first of all, they've got a bunch more people, right? They're far more evenly spread across the geography. And that creates these really interesting pockets of culture. So, for example, what it's like to run a startup in Seattle, because of their heritage and the number of days of sun, for example, is so different, right? Versus California versus Texas, And so you have to really ask yourself, what do I want? And when I was in Austin, I didn't fly to SF all that much, right? We did some product launches there and we went and pitched some investors, but that was about it. When I was in Seattle, it was far more regular because, first of all, it wasn't that far to travel. And also, Seattle and San Francisco's startup scene is very complementary. And, so like two of the founders of ZenDeals were in San Francisco. I was in Seattle with the engineering team. So we regularly looped through. It was also like a period in time thing too, right? Because when I did ZenDeals, which was 2011, even though the startup scene was well and truly rocking and rolling, there was still these pockets of like innovation and opportunity to slip into and try. And at that time, AI was super new. So when we built ZenDeals, the artificial intelligence that we used, or the machine learning that we used, was so new, right? And to give you a sense for people who are technical, like listening to the podcast, we were using a version of Docker that wasn't even Docker. It was the thing that came before Docker, which was called Lixie. So we were experimenting with Lixie well before Docker even arrived, and we were experimenting with technologies like MongoDB when they were in their infancy. So I feel like there was so much happening at that time. When I got to Austin, ML had been done. I was already back at Microsoft at that point doing, deep learning. Like, it didn't feel like there was as much excitement, brewing. I will say that at the moment, there's a renaissance happening because we are going through a phase where data is changing, and the conversation around data and how it travels through your organization and becomes, intelligence is really starting to form a new way of thinking. So I think that next wave of startups that start to focus on that are going to do some like amazing things.
So I guess switching gears to ZenDeals then, I know that, you just mentioned that 2011, did you say? About 10 years ago. Again, the landscape is very different. Machine learning, as you mentioned, was kind of at the very early stages of that. What did that look like in terms of kind of building, I guess, the future at a time when it was all very new and trying to get buy-in?
I'd been working in traditional software hardware in the Windows Azure team, and then got a chance when we essentially shipped and the team moved into a production setting under the server and tools business. I had the opportunity to go work R&D incubator under Ray Ozzie, a place called Live Labs. And Live Labs was headed up by a guy by the name of Gary Flake, very successful guy, had been part of Overture, which had been acquired by Yahoo for like billions of dollars, and then come to work at Microsoft under the personal invitation of Bill Gates. And his job was essentially to envision the next generation of data. So they had a product which essentially took very large images, tiled them, and then, you were able to do these deep zooms, right? Which is the technology was called deep zoom. But his background was in text analytics, and I'd never come across machine learning at that point. I honestly did not know what it was. And so when I got to Live Labs, he was a phenomenal, engineer and executive, and he'd still code. He'd code for hours at a day. So he had demonstrated this really cool search capability he'd built, and we all got around and kind of looked at this, and it was the first time I'd ever seen natural language processing. Right. And so he was just typing in some strings, and it was, doing a semantic similarity search, and it was returning these results. And he had hacked Bing essentially to do a better search. And I was just like, what is this? Right. Like, I really got to find, like, I want to know. So I was fortunate enough to sit in the office next to another phenomenal engineer, Alexander Zotov. And yeah, he was like a first principle Russian engineer, and his version of machine learning was pure math. And so I got to sit next to him and learn all about this over the course of a year. And so when I left, it never left me, right? Like, so I went on to then do cloud computing again for a year with PwC. And when Chris and Alexei reached out and said, hey, we've got this idea, I was like, look, the problem you're trying to solve is really like a robotics problem, right? Like, you need some kind of agent that's going to navigate these websites, but it has to do it in such a way that's not, brittle, right? Like, it can't be deterministic, like, it needs to be, probabilistic. And so we sat down and we built this demo. And the demo was all heuristical, based, just lots of if statements. And when we started the business, very quickly, I was like, we're going to outscale ourselves, right? Like, the more of these, systems we build to support the business, the more of these if statements we're going to have. And I feel like the stuff I learned at Microsoft could be really valuable here, but I need help. So, put in an ad on Indeed, I think it was at the time. And I put in a couple of keywords that I knew that if someone saw those, like, it was going to be the dog whistle, right? And they're going to come calling. And that's where, very dear friend of mine and co-conspirator Shreyas Karnik, applied, right? And when Shreyas came from a bioinformatics background. So he was very comfortable in traditional regression style machine learning, but also had a good natural language processing background. So we got together and we're like, let's ditch all these if then else statements and let's move from this deterministic way of thinking to this probabilistic way of thinking. And so, yeah, we started exploring support vector machines, which was the very first time we started doing machine learning. And it was amazing. Like there's no way to describe how powerful this stuff was to a super small startup trying to solve a very complex problem that at the time had been solved by about 120 human beings doing custom curation at RetailMeNot. So we're a team of literally 3 engineers trying to take on that. And we had to do it at a level of accuracy better than theirs. So we had to get 99.7% accuracy. So at that time when we're building it, first of all, there's not a lot of Stack Overflow articles to help you, right? So we couldn't really rely on the absolute oracle of software development, Stack Overflow. And also there isn't a lot of reference for like what looks right, because my only other reference was at Microsoft and that stuff was very new, right? So 2011, we're not only having to solve really hard distributed computing problems, we're also having to put a live machine learning system into place to support our fledgling startup and make sure that we can all put food on the table. So there was an immense amount of pressure to get it right. And I'd never been in that situation in my life before. So there is a lot of that in a startup where you're really applying the very best you can, but you're also just kind of praying that you get it right, but you don't really know if you will or not. So that was exhilarating. And it showed me as well how if you're building a startup, you have to innovate at the top of the IP chain, right? So in the IP pyramid, there's the lower bases that everyone can solve it, and it's probably been solved before, and people tend to like to sit at that area, right? And then as you get up the pyramid, you get to the place that's very hard to do, right? It's a totally unique, novel invention. Startups, unfortunately, today, right, struggle to innovate in that space because investors are afraid to invest in that space. So when you go to an investor and you say, can you invest in my crazy high, top of the IP pyramid, they go, do you make any money? And they're like, no, because when you're innovating at the top of the IP pyramid, right, things take a long time and looks more like AWS, right? Like you're wrong for a long time. And they go, no. Right? We need you to be earning MRR, right? And so what do, right? You go to the bottom of the pyramid and you build what everyone else is building. And you try and out-execute them marketing and sales-wise.
Just a book in the background, 0 to 1, falling to the ground.
So I think, in a situation where, you're trying to innovate, right? As a startup, if you're not bootstrapping, you're going to have to go to the VCs. They're going to steer that conversation to a degree. So I do look back at 2011 and I think, again, it was one of those intersection points where we found the right investors that were looking to invest in some interesting stuff, which gave us the ability to do some really risky things that we weren't necessarily good at. And the payoff was insane. Subsequently, and I certainly know that Chris would agree to this too, right? When we got into Super, we really were just turning the crank, right? We knew what every page of the playbook looked like. We knew exactly how to just recreate success. And we did, we created incredible success early, but it was so disinteresting and so unsatisfying. And that was a very, very strong lesson for me about if you're going to do a startup, do the startup the right way. Don't do it because you're just going to be a successful startup and, you're an experienced operator. Like it just doesn't feel good and it's not worth it.
There are so many things that I want to pick on over there. As I said, we're going to really struggle to stick to an hour in this. We might have to get you back for like 4 or 5 times. But Dave, one of the people that you mentioned in your story with ZenDeals was Shreyas, who, as you mentioned, came from a biomedical background. I actually had the opportunity to speak to him in the lead up to this interview as well. And one of the things that he mentioned was, obviously kind of given his background, although he was applying for the role, this wasn't something that he'd necessarily done before. It's a very kind of new field, and he felt, a little bit of imposter syndrome, I guess, or kind of his version of it. And he said that what you said to him on day one was, it doesn't matter what your background is. If you want to pick up skills, you'll be good at what you do. And I guess especially when you're kind of, talking about building up that little sort of triangle or kind of innovating at the forefront where, there aren't hundreds of people that have this core capability that they've been able to apply for before. What are things that you're looking for in people to help you identify the right people to come and join you on that journey? Yeah.
So there's an extra thing that Shreyas didn't say, is part of that, right? Was there's nothing, and I said this to Shreyas on day one, right? I was like, there's nothing you can do that I can't undo. And so I want you to go balls to the wall, right? I want you to take massive risk because if you don't, we waste this opportunity. because we might as well just go work for a paycheck. And so that was a very motivating discipline for me. I wanted my team to feel like there was nothing they couldn't go and experiment, and if they did and things fell off, that as a team we would come together and fix it. No one was on their own. The other thing that was really important with Shreyas was that he was very honest about the fact that he wasn't an engineer. But when he did the coding exercise, what I saw, and this is what's really important about that experience, I don't believe in the first shot, right? So everyone does a coding exercise with me, and they think it's because they need to nail it on the first shot. And in fact, it's not. With my coding assessments, I send them the exercise. No matter what they send back, I'm going to follow up. And the reason is, when you're working in engineering and you work at places like Microsoft and Amazon, it's your stamina and your ability to stay focused over long iterations that makes you successful. So everyone submits their response back, and I immediately go back and say, well, actually, what about this? And what about that, right? Sometimes I'm even being purposely infuriating and changing the goalposts. And I did that with Shreyas, right? So he did it perfectly. And I went back and I was like, well, you haven't done it to PEP8 standard, which is a Python coding standard. And he was like, okay, no problem. I'll just go do it. And then I was like, oh, actually, now I wanted this other thing. And actually, now can you do this other thing, right? And at no point did he ever go, hang on, man, like, I don't have time for this, right? Which is what other people did, right? Other people would go like, hey, I already completed the exercise. I have no more time. I'm too busy, right? Or they'd be like, you didn't ask for that in the first one, right? Like, this is some new exercise, right? And the problem is that in a startup, that's what it looks like, right? It's interrupt-driven development. You don't know what you're going to do until you are doing the thing you're doing and someone taps you on the shoulder and goes, not the right thing to do. Or you finish what you're doing and you're like, what do we do next? And they'll tell you at that point, right? But there's no sprint time. Like, when I talk to startups and they're like, we have 2-week sprint cadences, it's like, so what you've actually got is a 2-week buffer before you realize you've made a mistake, right? And interrupt-driven development, the way I did it, was like, we'd find that out in minutes, right? And we're always working on the right thing at the right time. So what I needed was people who recognized that, I'm not paying you to build an artifact, right? Like, you shouldn't take any pride in the artifact, right? You should take pride in the process and the team you're building it with. And in doing that, you will always focus on what we're trying to do for the customer rather than what you're trying to do for yourself. And again, Shreyas is absolute epitome of the perfect engineer in that way, because he was someone who's like, I will keep iterating and I will keep changing and I'll keep modifying myself. And there's nothing I won't do and there's nothing I can't do, right, to get the job done. And that attitude is so much more important, because I can teach someone just about anything if they're willing to do it. But even the most smartest person is pretty much useless if you can't ask them to learn something new, right? Because no one knows everything going into a startup that's going to make them successful. You learn that day in, day out. And there's another thing that I learned with startups, right, which is the peak of elation and the trough of despair. So the peak of elation is incredibly narrow. It lasts for literally a fleeting moment. And the troughs of despair go forever. And if you're not someone who has come from a basic background, right, of having to deal with that and built that grit, you're just going to fail. So one of the other things that was important that I'm sure like you'll ask, like, I don't know if Shreyas mentioned it, right? But in the interview process, I asked him, when was the last time you got angry with someone? Right? And he was like totally taken aback. He's like, what? And I was like, yeah, when was the last time you got angry with someone? And he had to share this story of like driving with his dad and his dad kind of annoying him and him getting angry, right? And it's like, right, because there's such a human empathy component as part of this, that if it's all just about the code, we're not actually going to be able to build something amazing. So yeah, I do reflect back on that period, and I reflect back on that all the way up to CodePilot, right? And really thinking about empathy and, not looking at like what school you went to and how many Facebook internships you've done, but really looking at the core of the person, right? And trying to work out whether that's someone who's going to sink or swim.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like it gets stated over and over again, and I keep seeming to have like made this mistake multiple times, but hiring people based on experience or kind of those sort of things, no two businesses are the same and any of those sort of things either. So although it's good for someone to have that experience, if you can't, they're not the right fit personality-wise. And I think that's what you were sort of trying to gauge from that kind of interrupt-driven sort of approach as well. And testing that with Shreyas, it wouldn't have worked regardless of how good of an engineer he was.
Absolutely right. And especially having had the opportunity to work with people who are objectively experts in their field, but also understanding that they're working within very rigid constraints. So someone like Dave Cutler, who's absolutely phenomenal, right, has contributed things that, are like the source of Turing awards and stuff like that, would die in a startup, right? Because it's just he wouldn't be able to operate at the best of his ability because there aren't the constraints and boundaries he needs to operate. Someone like Shreyas is phenomenal in a startup because he is comfortable with the ambiguity and the lack of constraints, but also able to get to the end goal, which is so important.
Speaking of the end goal, you've kind of touched on ZenDeals and the sort of acquisition process that you kind of went through within 2 years for, as you mentioned earlier, for life-changing money, which is obviously a dream for so many founders. But I think a lot of founders want an acquisition or kind of chase it, but they don't really understand that process. And you've been through that process multiple times now. Really curious in what that looked like specifically for ZenDeals and doing that.
Yeah, so when we started ZenDeals, we started with this idea that we wanted to build this amazing culture, right? And we talked about it. I think it might have even been on our pitch deck at some point, like slide 15 or something. But I didn't really understand what that meant, and I didn't really have an intention to honor it, right? For me, it was just something you put in, around 2011, you put that in your slide decks. And then what happened was the first hire we had was this guy named Matt, super awesome guy, really talented engineer. And we started working on the prototype together. Shreyas joined. Then we had another fellow join, Nate, who again was like a phenomenal engineer, but such a different personality. And so that was the other thing. I wanted to create an incredibly diverse team. I did not want everyone to be the same. And I wanted conflict, right? I wanted them to push each other's buttons, right? Because I felt like that was going to create something interesting. So we had our engineering office in Kirkland in Washington State, not far from Microsoft and not far from Seattle. And the business team were based in Palo Alto. So every day we come into this tiny little co-working space. And I used to joke, right, that my ultimate setup is where I can actually reach out and grab one of my engineers, right? And it was like that. We were all in a little pocket. So what happened was we'd come into work every day and we'd be working really closely, right? And the way that we were kind of ebbing and flowing and releasing software just started to become so stylistic. And there was an ergonomics that built up around that. And so for a year and a half, my working days looked exactly the same and the same people. And you start to build this culture. For example, when it was just me and Matt, we would always go get coffee together, right? Well, when Shreyas joined, it would be well, you've just got to come now too. There's not really do you want to get a coffee? It's we're going to coffee. But by the time James and Nate, joined the team, right? It was we all go to coffee. They just were all right. So we'd all get up, go get coffee, come back, right? And so we started doing everything together, right? And also we'd do these offsites because the team was based in Palo Alto, right? So we'd do these offsites every quarter with the explicit intention of never doing any kind of strategy sessions. We would literally just go get drunk and have a great time and go bowling and karaoke. And it was because we realized that a distributed team like that has to build connective tissue, right? So that when things go bad, you can support each other. But also they had their own culture in Palo Alto, right? Alexi always ate Vegemite, at his desk, and, they didn't really go out for lunch, right? And so it was so fascinating when we'd come together and we'd kind of swap this culture between us. So, about a year and a half in, we start really hitting our stride. And the goal was to take down, when I say take down, RetailMeNot would have these voucher code pages per merchant. And they'd make $40,000, $50,000, off these pages. And our goal was, if we could get one of these pages off on our website to perform as well as them using the AI, then we had something to essentially raise again. And so the story goes, Chris and Alexi are out to lunch in Palo Alto. Our analyst at the time, Brian, super awesome bloke as well, is in the office. He rings Chris and Alexi and he goes, there's this dude in the waiting room. Now, to give you a sense of what the room was, it was just an open plan office where there was a couch randomly in the middle. That was the waiting room. And there was a very tall gentleman and another shorter gentleman waiting there. And so Alexi didn't even have a business shirt on. So he literally came in, went through the toilet, put on a shirt that he had waiting in the bathroom and came out. And it was Cotter Cunningham and Stephen Foe, who are from RetailMeNot, Cotter being the CEO. And we didn't know this, but they were essentially about to go public. And we'd turned up on a report by Credit Suisse that listed us as a threat. Because we had AI that could outperform 120 humans. And we'd just taken their top page. We were the ones winning the SEO on that top page. If we just turned the dial, right, we would have taken that whole $200 million business ourselves. So knowing that, he rocked up and he said, I'm here to make you an offer you can't refuse, right? I'm here to buy you cash, no stock and all that kind of stuff, pure cash. And I remember we met internally and we were like, first of all, what's right for the investors, right? This is a significant 4x return for them. This is amazing for us, right? And we've only been doing this for a year and a half and we can do so much more with their resources. So we went through the due diligence perspective. If people have never been through due diligence, it is one of the most invasive experiences you can have because you don't do anything, your startup goes on pause. You respond to all of these requests that the acquiring company has, and they take a long time because the requests that they have aren't what you do. So you have to customize what you do to produce this data for them so they can go, okay, we'll buy you. And once you get to a certain depth in the process, you are kind of committed. You can't back out. So for us, we spent 6 months essentially in due diligence and didn't do anything with the business. And in the back of your mind, you're going, I hope this isn't a game. Because if this is a tactic of theirs to just completely, have us like derail, this is a great strategy. But it wasn't. They were genuine. Anyway, so we flew to Texas and, Austin's hot and, we were like going through this due diligence. And the other thing that you'll find out in due diligence is people set a bar for you far higher than their own, right? So they'll ask you questions and you'll be like, how do you do that yourself? And they're like, we don't. Oh, great, right? And so you have to get A+ on everything. But there's a big carrot at the end of it, right? So we get acquired, and I think we talked about this before, right? So again, if you've ever raised money, and I never knew what this was like before, when you raise money, especially a pre-seed round, normally you have a bank account. Normally that bank account is connected to like literally the mobile phone of everybody, like in the founding team. And when they transfer the money, they literally transfer the money. Like I remember Chris sending a screenshot of the Bank of America account with 1.3 million in there, right? And it just, you're like, oh my God, we could run off with this right now and buy a party house, right? Like it's so weird, right? None of this makes any sense when you're in the especially the first time round. And so, we negotiate, the sale. It was 18 million cash, that's public. And what happens is they do 50. So they did a 50-50 deal where 50% was given up front and then 50% was held back over 2 years to be given in equal installments. And so 50% for all of the people who had stock in the company happened on the day they signed the deal. And so what happens on the day that signs the deal is you're sitting around. I always use that joke of like, the scene in Goodfellas, right? Where they're waiting around the diner to see if Joe Pesci gets made as a made man, right? And so we're in Top Bot Donuts in Redmond, the whole engineering team with donuts and coffee just waiting. In Austin, Texas, in the boardroom of RetailMeNot, the accountant is sitting with the CEO, literally with their website, like the bank website up, and he goes, wire transfer. And literally 2 seconds later, your thing goes beep, and you have 50% of this money in your bank account, right? That's how it plays out. So you go suddenly from like barely making ends meet to like, holy crap, right? Like anything's possible now. But you as a person haven't really made that transition, right? Like in the speed in which that money hits you, you are not prepared for it. So that was the first thing that really struck me. The second thing was when we got to RetailMeNot, and I kind of created this saying from that experience was, I called it, we went through the loading dock, right? And the reason I said that was they bought ZenDeals and they just brought us in and dropped us in a set of desks, right? But everyone else in that company had been interviewed, had been through an interview loop, had a bunch of people meet on a debrief and agree that they want that person part of the family. And that was done through a chain of command, right? Through an organic group of people that you work with. For us, the CEO decided that these new people were joining the family and just adopted us, right? So as a result, I think traditionally M&A is done terribly, right, in acquisitions. It's why most startups leave either right after earnout or even before earnout. And it's because you never get embraced into the culture, right? You never go through the front door, right? You go through the back door, the loading dock. And so what happens is they treat you differently. And the other thing as well is just as abrupt the lifestyle changes as when that money hits, it's also as abrupt as the culture changes. Because every day you've been rocking into that office, it's been your way, right? Like everyone's put their fingerprints on the culture, right? When you sell the business, you don't sell your culture. Your culture dies right at the point that they sign, the SPA. And so it's very hard to quantify and value what that means till after it's gone, right? And then you go into someone else's culture, and the chances that their culture lines up with yours is zero. Like I don't care who you are, and I don't care what story you want to tell. When you get acquired, your culture will never lap and overline with the acquiring company's culture. So now you either have to assimilate, which is very hard because the reason they acquired you is because you're doing things they can't do. Or what happens is you end up getting dragged into things that aren't interesting anymore, right? And so, I enjoyed 2 years, but at the same time, it was a hard 2 years compared to the 1.5 at ZenDeals. And the thing I missed most about ZenDeals was rocking to work up every day, working on cool things with people I infinitely loved and trusted and respected, and really doing something that another big company couldn't do, right? They paid us a ton of money for it. So that will always be a defining moment for me because I learned very quickly how badly M&A gets done when acquiring startups and how much work should be done by acquiring companies that isn't. And everyone then scratches their head and goes, why did this amazing, exceptional team of talented people and ultimately a talent drought leave our company, right? And, it's like when startups talk about like CAC over LTV, right? And they go, got to acquire a new customer. We're acquiring 20,000 customers a week and stuff like that. And it's like, you realize the cost of acquisition of a new customer is exorbitantly more than retaining your existing customer. And in a talent drought, it cracks me up that these companies pay insane amounts of money for ultimately people, not technology, and then don't do everything they can to retain those people, right? Like it's the craziest thing, right? It's like buying a really expensive car and parking it out on the street and just never looking at it again, right? It makes no sense. So those were things that really hit me. And again, like I think founders get into a place where the grind is so hard that when someone comes along and says, hey, I'll stop this pain for you and here's a ton of money, they go, yeah. But the problem is, right, the pain they're feeling is really just a factor of being in a startup. And they try and solve for that pain with the acquisition. And then after 3 months, you go, I'm not feeling the pain anymore. And then you start to miss that beautiful experience every day. And you go, that was unique. I wish I hadn't given that up. Was that really worth the money? It never is, right? So I think anyone building a startup that's doing good, always think about you're selling more than just your product, right, and your customer base. You're selling your culture, and you won't get to take that with you.
So it's really interesting, getting that level of insight. And I think you're so right in terms of it's just so difficult to have, cultures lining up and aligning. I guess having gone through that experience that you went through with ZenDeals, for the subsequent acquisitions that you went through, was there any sort of learnings or different approaches that you took, or again, any recommendations for founders that are potentially going through that acquisition process to consider what they may negotiate or what that might look like for them?
So one of the things that really struck me out of that, and it was a formative experience, was the first thing is you start to become really aware of doing a deal. So when we did ZenDeals, they said, this is what's going to happen. You go, okay, right? Like, you just don't know. But the earnout is negotiable, and your role in the earnout is negotiable too. Also, how you build your startup ultimately allows you to roll off really quickly or not. So those were two key learnings that both Chris and I had from ZenDeals, that when we did Super, we were very, very careful to make sure that it was turnkey. The problem with ZenDeals was the way we built the technology. You needed the team, right? The team was inextricably linked to the technology. And Genie, which was the technology, was also incredibly complicated, and we hadn't done anything to abstract that complexity away. So when they acquired us, they acquired the engine and they acquired the mechanics, and they had to keep them for a long time. I mean, it took 6 months to fully integrate Genie into their systems, right? Which is kind of crazy if you think about it. So when we did Super, we were very conscious that everything was essentially ready to go, that we could just hand over the logins, literally, and you could, with very minimal support, run the business, right? And we'd abstracted all the technology away. So when we were acquired by Broomley, it was an incredibly easy transition. And part of the acquisition was we're not going to come with you, right? Like, that was explicit, right? We're like, don't want to join your company. Here's our business and technology and everything. We'll go through due diligence. We'll hand off I think it was 6 weeks handover, but it was very explicit. Now, obviously you give things up in that valuation and stuff like that, but it's so worth it because you sell the business, 6 weeks later, you're done, right? And you can go do whatever you want, right? So that was lesson number one. With CodePilot, very similar. Build something that's standalone that you just literally hand over the logins. It's super easy to operate. AngelList was a little bit different because in acquiring the technology, they also wanted the knowledge that I had in AI/ML to continue with the business. But again, the way we negotiated that was, let's do the deal around the technology and the product, and let's do a separate deal about Dave Lemphers joining, because then under that situation, if something changes or we don't want to continue, that's fine, right? They're separate transactions. So my lesson learned there, and my advice to startup founders who are going through building a startup is a couple of things. First of all, when you're building your product, build it in such a way that if you were to die tomorrow, anyone else could come in and continue your business. So don't think about it necessarily as like a due diligence activity or a way to get out of the earnout. Think about it as just good business continuity practices, because it's not just the acquisition that's going to make you end your time at a startup, right? For example, you might hit the 4 years, be fully vested and not want to do it anymore. And you should leave the business in a really good way so that your investment continues, right? So you should be able to just walk away and everything can continue as usual. So that's the first thing, make sure everything is just turnkey and can be easily handed over to another person. And then the other thing as well is build with the mindset that this thing should be able to operate if you get locked out of the office for a couple of weeks or something like that. So these are things we didn't do at ZenDeals. ZenDeals was incredibly bespoke, right? With a lot of bells and alarms and whistles that you needed to be ready, like kind of lost, right? Like it's like you need to press it every 12 hours. And as we built these systems, especially with Super, especially CodePilot, right? CodePilot was 100% automated. The thing could run by itself without you having to do anything, right? And it was intentionally designed that way because it just makes those transactions easier. And it means you don't have to go across if you don't want to. So if you go and the company's great, stay, no problem, right? If you go and it's not really your jam, no dramas. Like they'll say fine, no problem. But so yeah, those are two things that certainly in any startup I do from now on will absolutely motivate some of the design principles, because it just means that if we do end up having to exit the company, you don't have to go along for an extended period of time. You can just kind of roll off into the next thing.
Yeah, that's great advice. Obviously that's kind of talking about it from an acquisition perspective. I want to jump back to the start of that because, you've kind of gone through the process multiple times now. A lot of founders, struggle to have one exit. You've had 4 of these now over time. And I know from previous conversations we've spoken about, and one of the analogies that I love that you've given is running a good startup is like a Michelin star restaurant. It's not just about over-indexing in one particular area, it's about having the right ingredients in place. So given your experience and, given that you mentioned that you kind of ran that playbook when you're running Super specifically, what does that look like? What are the lessons that you have kind of taken that help you build a company that goes on to be successful and eventually be acquired?
So the first thing is you have to start every startup with the idea that you are building something insanely huge. The reason I say that is if you are building something small, so if we're making a sandwich, right? And we make our Vegemite sandwich, right? There's 2 of us and we're going to look at the sandwich and we're going to go, okay, that's half of what that looks like, right? If instead we go, we're going to fill this whole table with the biggest sandwich we've ever made, well, we're already going to make decisions because, well, you and I are clearly going to be well fed, right? And we're probably going to be able to feed a lot of people, right? So we're not going to go into a mindset that makes us feel like, I need to preserve myself or, I need to keep everything for myself, right? So like you want a real growth mindset, right? Not a survival mindset. So the first thing is think big, right? Think about whatever you're doing is going to be huge. The next part of that is find amazing founders, but find founders that are diametrically opposed to you, right? Because here's the thing with diversity, right? If you and I are exactly the same and we're working on a problem, when we're going to solve that problem exactly the same way, the chances are that we're going to find problems that map to our particular skill sets all the time, almost zero in a startup. So there's going to be things that pop up that if we are exactly the same, not only our capability to deal with them is going to be the same, but our desire to deal with them is going to be the same as well, right? So if we're doing a startup and we need to go and do payroll, right? Or we have to go do the tax return. If you and I are exactly the same, if you and I like me, right? And I can't do my tax returns, I fucking hate them, right? Then,
me too.
Right, well then we're fucked, right? But for example, if you love analytics and data and you love doing all that, like you love Excel spreadsheets and you love like keeping everything in order, right? Then that's really great. But what if as well at the same time you're that kind of person and you don't really like technical details, coding, technology, right? So having that diversity in the founding team in those early days when you have to do everything yourself, there's no department that you file a ticket for, right? Like everything is done from stocking the toilet paper, right? To what orange juice you buy is your team, right? So pick really diverse people who fit the primary points of the star of a good business, right? So what are those? Find someone who, and I always say this to you, right? Hacking and hustling, right? So if you're hustling, you're trying to find a mark, right? You're trying to find someone to play your tricks on. That's a skill, right? And that's your salesperson, right? They're a person who can get out there and they can fill the pipeline, right? And they're so rabid about what you're doing. You haven't even built anything and they're like, oh, it's the best thing you've ever seen, right? So they're just naturally out there. Find someone who's great at operations, right? They're the person who's going to file the bloody tax returns and file the documents required in your state and do all of the minutiae, right, that the creative folks don't want to do, but these people love him, right? So if you've ever seen that character Amy in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, like you want that person, right, who gets excited about the tabs on the filing cabinet, right? Like, so find someone who's going to do all of the minutiae and the drudgery and the administrivia. Find someone who's going to go find those customers and get them so excited about your product. Find the person who's going to solve those technical problems. And they don't have to be the CTO. They're just someone who's truly passionate about building and solving problems and is fearless to do that, right? Like, don't find someone who's done really, really well in one thing. Find someone who's tried a bunch of things, right? And really is excited about learning and growing, right? So as, you know, we would always say, right, like that learn and be curious, right? Like find that kind of person. If you can get a founding team that's incredibly diverse, that fits those primary areas, what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to build something and sell it to someone and run a good business with good business hygiene that will then be able to scale on. The problem when you find people who are homogenous, right? A la two business folks go build a business or two tech guys build a business. The problem is that they're going to do great for the things that fall into their skill category. And as soon as they meet something that doesn't, the wheels come off. Right? It's stressful. And if you think about the flow diagram, right? Like, you know, when you've got two people who are just sitting inside the flow space, when they both get bored and they both get freaked out, it's terrible for a business. But if the founding team's in the flow space and some people are dropping in and out, but there's always someone in the flow space, business is going on great. So that's the first thing. Okay, but now you're finding this founding team. What does it matter if you're thinking big? The reason is that you want to bring on as many of those people as possible. This idea that you have like, you know, mom and dad of a startup, right? Like, no, right? Like this is like a poly family, right? Like, so if you happen to have 7 mates, right, who you love working with and you take a bullet for, and they're all diverse. One of them is like bloody marine biologist or something, right? If they're willing to come and jump in the boat with you, let them in, right? Because remember, it's a table full of Vegemite sandwiches, right? Or as like a mate of mine, Shelby, will attest to, as I always say, everyone gets a beer. Right? That scene in Nacho Libre, right? At the end when they lose and they go into the change room and the guy comes and gives the money. He's like, what for? And he goes, everyone gets a bit, right? So when you think big, right, you don't start thinking scarcity. You can let more people into that team and then you can be more diverse and do more things. So then the downside of that is like, well, if you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, right? Well, no, like everyone's running their own station. But ultimately, so that's the next part, right? Think really, really big pie allows you to put lots of diverse people in to take care of all the things that make a good startup. But you need to have a model for how you operate, right? What's your blueprint for culture? And for me, why I've always used the Michelin star idea, right, is when you eat a Michelin star meal, it's not just the steak that's the star of the show, right? Like the turnips are just as good as the steak. When you go to most restaurants, there's the star of the show and then there's everything else right on the plate, whether you eat it or not, who gives a shit. And I think what I love about Michelin star is everything from like the cutlery to the you know, tableware, right, to the stations inside the restaurant are done at the highest level of quality and care. So if you want to build a phenomenal startup, everyone in that organization, no matter how diverse they are, should all align on the one principle that the thing they do should be done to the uppermost capability they have. Like it should be done to the gold standard. So if you're filing the tax return, do it to the gold standard. If you're the guy fixing the bugs, do it to the gold standard. If you're filling the sales pipeline, do it to the gold standard. Because what happens then is the overall experience for the customer is a Michelin star experience. And I think that's where a lot of startups, unfortunately, early on, right, looking to please investors, looking to bump up their MRR, do things that aren't, you know, gold standard. Right? And they end up just being Maccas, right? And that's fine. There's a place in the world for Maccas. But I think if you want to build something that someone else is going to look at and go, that's impressive, then you need to think that way. Because if you get acquired, no one's acquiring a Big Mac, right? They're trying to acquire Gordon Ramsay's, you know, what's the fucking scallops, right? So yeah, like I think these are things I've learned over the startups. I think whatever startup I do next will have features of that because I've realized that those were the critical parts that led to success. You know, everything else is given, right? You know, when people go like, I just want to work hard. Yeah, you're going to have to work hard, right? Like doing a startup, you're earning 3 times less and working 4 times as much. Like that's not, you know, that's not virtuous, right? Like, you know, but yeah, like people who are very different to you, so important.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's obviously something that's come up time and time again over the last 5 years of the show is the importance of people and getting the right people in, as you've just mentioned. Again, something that George mentioned in my conversation with him was, you know, when he invested in, was it CodePilot?
CodePilot, yeah.
Yeah, that he invested in. He mentioned that, you know, he really just invested in you. And obviously there was an opportunity with CodePilot, but you just like, he said your superpower was just you were so passionate about what it is that you did that he wanted to come in. He mentioned that his friends and family, who again didn't really understand the business, were just really enthused by what it is that you were building and wanted to invest as well. And you know, part of everyone talks about, you know, finding the best people and trying to find the best people for your startup and get them on board. It is exceptionally hard to convince people without having millions of dollars in funding and all those sort of things to try and convince people to earn 3 times less than they're kind of earning elsewhere.
Totally.
To join. How do you think about things, especially at the early stages of a company, in trying to share that vision with people that gets them excited and gets them to want to leave whatever it is that they're doing to come and join you on the journey?
So again, I'm an engineer, right? So I think very practically, right? So first of all, what are the things you absolutely know when you sit down with a founder, right? And this is very different when you're pitching a VC, is unless they've been around and you can read about them, right? Like there's extrinsic proof somewhere. Chances are they're just full of shit, right? They're just a bunch of hackers and hustlers and carnies, right? Like, you know, it's like the tent at the very end of the circus, right? And bad lighting and like toothless operators and stuff. So there's like, that's why I always used to laugh when people go like, I only ever hire from MIT. And you're like, oh yeah, because they're lined up around the corner, right? Like you at the very end of like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, and every Airbnb, Slack, right? Like when they finally get to you, if you think you're going to hold up MIT, good luck, right? Like see how that goes. So that was the first thing. You have to be very self-aware of who you are, right? And your place in the world, right? Because if you go out there and you think you're bigger than you are, people aren't going to buy it. And another thing as well is like selling someone on a product, right, is not going to get them across the line, right? Because you're talking to people possibly who are working full-time, and what you're saying to them is, come and join me on a journey where you're going to earn very little and it's going to be really risky that you'll even get that paycheck, right? So what's the trade-off, right? And my sales point was always, I'll make you one promise. You will leave me better than you came to me. That's all I can promise you. Everything else, if I try to promise you, it's bullshit, and I'm not going to do that. And so what it was credibility, right? Like I'm a seasoned engineer. I've got real credible experience, right? You can type my name into Google. Like I'm like Google famous, right? So like you can type my name and you'll see what I've done and you'll see what I've achieved. So if you come on this journey with me, what I will promise you is that anything I can teach you, right? Anything you're willing to learn, any opportunity you want to push yourself, I will give that to you here. And if you want to build a financial model around what that looks like, you'll quickly realize that you're earning less than you do at your job now, but your overall value, your enterprise value as a human is going through the roof. Because the experience you're going to get in this startup is not available anywhere else because it's unique, right? And I think if you ask any of the people who've worked with me in any of my startups, they'll tell you that that's exactly what I say to them, right? Like, why should I come work for your startup, right? Because you will leave better than you came. That's it. I can't promise anything more than that. And I could probably make some loose promises that we'll probably lose our shirts, right? And, but I'll promise you another thing, right? That whatever your current promotion trajectory is and has been, if a dotted line, I will put a considerable kink in that, right? Because when you come and work at these types of startups, you work at a Michelin star restaurant, whether it wins or loses, the person you become and go back to those places, you might leave as a kitten and you'll go back as a lion, right? And so those organizations know the value of that. So suddenly your chart for promotion looks very different and you'll probably go back 2-3 levels more than you left in a very short period of time. So I think there's a lot of factors that people don't consider But here's the other thing. When you tell people that and they go, yeah, I don't buy it, that's fine. Like, you're not meant to be on this journey. But again, when I met with Shreyas and I told him, hey, you will leave better than you came. And he was like, I believe it, right? And that's worth more than what you're doing right now. He goes, I believe you. And that's what happened, right? He left infinitely better than he came and is now gone on to become a principal software engineer at a well-funded Greylock startup, right? Like, he was not on that trajectory, right? But he took a risk, right? And that's where he ended up, So again, I think when you're speaking to people and selling them on a vision, selling them on clean water or like solving hunger and stuff, like, that's not what they're going to come for, right? They're going to come for the visceral experience day in, day out. The other reason that's really important is when things go bad, and inevitably 80% of your startup will be terrible, terrible low days, that is the only thing that will keep them nourished, right? Because when we're not selling to customers and we're like down to like we're literally down to the brake pads, like that's a startup, right? Don't kid yourself that startups are like Swiss balls and catered lunches. They're not. So when you are in that depth, that pit of despair, being able to work on things that are so awesome that no one else is getting to work on is what's going to get you through. And so be very wary of startups that don't have that. Right? What's the thing that you're creating? How am I going to be better when this all goes to shit, right? When it all goes to hell in a handbasket and it's gonna, how am I going to eject out of the startup canopy better than I came? And if they can't give you a really rock solid answer, then it's not going to be good, right? But if they're like, oh, we're making 100 MRR and blah, 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 right? But like, what are they doing, right? Just like crazy sales execution, crazy roll up revenue, like, that's what it is, right? So yeah, don't go work at a fast food startup, go work at a Michelin star restaurant.
The other thing that Shreyas mentioned to me was, and you just touched on this, was he really wanted to come and work with you because of everything that you said, but also that he got to work on really difficult problems that he wasn't getting to do elsewhere.
Yep.
And I love that kind of fact that you just kind of mentioned in terms of doing things that help you grow, help you kind of like focus, and are really challenging. Is that things that you think about when launching your startup, or I guess when you're going through that hiring process? Are there kind of particular traits that you've already mapped out in terms of these are the types of traits that we're looking for in people, or the types of people that we want in place?
Yeah. So, I always use my pyramid, and I never want to work on the, bottom half of the pyramid. If I'm not working on the top of the pyramid, which are problems that scare me. And so I always want to build startups that are working on problems that make people feel uncomfortable inside the organization, right? Like, if we're coming to work every day and we're like, oh, this in the handbag, well, that's not going to be a good startup. We should be coming, like, I believe in the flow states. I don't believe you should work on things that are so hard that you don't get them done and you just feel demoralized every day. No, don't do that. And obviously don't work on startups that are like mark exec, we're just churning up the leads. Don't work on that either, right? Also, these comments are like mine and mine alone. Like, I don't think that this is in the Harvard Business Review or something. Like, I have a very specific way of thinking about startups. And I think I'm very old school engineering mindset too. Like, I want to work on cool like rockets and shit. I don't want to work on stuff that's just successful. But yeah, so then the flow state, right? There's just a natural middle point, right? There's the middle point of like, I'm working on stuff that challenges me, but I'm capable of doing it and I'm moving along. And then there's two sides of that. I'm working on things that are interesting, but they're kind of easy, right? Like, I can do them, right? And I know I can, but I'm going to make it look like it's really hard. And then there's the things where it's like, every time I go into this part of the flow state, I sweat a little bit and I freak out and I don't have sleepless nights, right? Like, but I get it done, right? And more importantly, when I get it done, it doesn't look good.
Yeah.
But that's good, right? Because the more stuff you do that feels uncomfortable and that you do badly just means that the next time you'll do it better, best, right? So that's where you want to live, right? Because what you're actually going to do is your flow state's going to expand, right? And you start to become just a better, kind of animal. So I think that's the first thing. And so what you're looking for in people is a natural desire to expand their flow states. Because if you find, like, again, Shreyas, right? If you find someone like Shreyas, I don't care what he knows, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Show me a time you've increased your flow state, right? So you look at a guy like Shreyas, right? He's like, hey, I, moved from India to, like the middle of like Indiana, right? And attended an amazing school and did stuff that was really hard, right? But he pushed himself constantly in the perfect place of the flow state, right? So he was published documents, he's cited, he's a cited academic, he's a practitioner, always looking to better, always introspecting himself, right? And that was what I wanted, right? And in fact, all of the people in my team were those people, right? There were people who were constantly pushing their flow state, and growing it over time, resetting that bar. So the place that, a year before was uncomfortable, right, and unproductive, suddenly was uncomfortable productive. And I think that's really critical, right? Look for people who've demonstrated that in their life. It doesn't have to be what you're building, because those people will help you build at the top of the pyramid because the others don't want to do it, right? Because that's the other thing as well, Ro, is like you want to find people who want to play in that space and they want to do it because the other people won't do it. So that goes to another thing I wanted to kind of say, right? We work really hard, right? I always work really hard in startups. And the reason I do it is I have this anxiety that somewhere out there, and I used to always say this to the team, right? It's like somewhere out there, there's another team like us. If you think we're unique, we're not, right? There's another team exactly like us, right? It's like that Seinfeld episode, right? With the opposite mirrors. Like there's another team just like us, and they're working just as hard times 0.1. And what's going to happen is when this does crash to the ground and we have to exit over the wings, the fiery fuselage, we're going to look back, right? And if we didn't put everything we possibly could into this, we're going to see that team go over the first class. You know what I mean? So you have to be internally motivated to work as hard as you possibly can under a level of anxiety that someone else is going to do more. The reason is that if you do that and you fail, you never look back and see another team, right? You were the team, right? And that was it. But if you take that day off, and I'm not advocating for a bad work-life balance at all. I'm just saying bring a level of intensity that you absolutely know you gave it all when you were there, right? You left it all out on the field because when it does go badly, you'll go, I gave it my all. You never want that one sliver of doubt that was like, I didn't bring it that day, right? I sat in the comfort zone. So yeah, look for people who feel comfortable in that upper half of the flow state. They will do amazing things, right?
Absolutely. You want shared values, but I guess diversity in skill sets in the people, right? Like you want them to have the same sort of work ethic, drive, wanting to change the flow state as you put it, but have different skills that they bring to the table.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. Dave, it's been an absolutely amazing discussion. So glad to finally do this and have you on the podcast. I think we'll have to bring you back and wrap up
I would love
all of the other things that I wanted to speak to you about as well. But Dave, for anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
LinkedIn for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Find me on LinkedIn and send me a message.
Awesome. I will make sure that I add that into the show notes. Dave,
awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Ro. I loved it.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 144 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.